When Lenin, the father of the Soviet Revolution, drew his final breath in 1924, the empire he built stood at a crossroads. His dream of a worker's paradise was now leaderless, and the vultures began to circle. Among them were two men who once called each other comrades: Leon Trotsky, the brilliant revolutionary general who had led the Red Army to victory in the Civil War, and Joseph Stalin, the quiet, calculating party secretary few truly feared. Yet, as the morning processions for Lenin filled the frozen streets of Moscow, Stalin moved in the shadows, positioning himself not just as Lenin's successor, but as the guardian of his legacy. He took control of the funeral, edited Lenin's final words, and slowly poisoned Trotsky's reputation within the party. While Trotsky debated ideology, Stalin mastered loyalty. By the time Trotsky realized the trap had closed, it was too late. The revolution's hero would soon become its exile. And Stalin, the man no one expected, would rise from the ashes of Lenin's death to rule an empire of fear. With Trotsky cast into the political wilderness, Stalin began weaving his web. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was the one who listened, remembered, and waited. Inside the marble halls of the Communist Party, he quietly placed his allies in every key position, men who owed their power not to the revolution, but to him. Rivals were labeled enemies of the state, their words twisted into betrayal. One by one they vanished, exiled, silenced, erased from photographs as if they had never existed. While Trotsky still believed ideas could win battles, Stalin understood the truth. In politics, survival meant control. Control of the party, control of the press, control of fear. By 1929, the transformation was complete. Trotsky, once the hero of the Red Army, was forced into exile, his voice fading into the cold wind of history. And in Moscow, a new czar without a crown had emerged. Joseph Stalin, calculating, relentless, and unseen, now ruled the Soviet Union. The revolution was over. The reign of terror had just begun. Stalin's grip on power was now absolute, and his vision for the Soviet Union was nothing short of total transformation. He promised to drag a nation of peasants into the modern age, but his method was terror. Across the endless plains of Russia and Ukraine, the order came down: collectivization. Farms were seized. Families were forced to give up their land, their tools, their very lives to the state. Those who resisted were branded as kulaks, enemies of the people. Entire villages were rounded up, deported to the frozen gulags of Siberia, or simply executed. Fields once golden with wheat turned barren. Animals were slaughtered rather than surrendered. And then came the famine. In Ukraine, it was called the Holodomor, the death by hunger. Millions perished as the government seized grain for export, even while people starved in their own homes. Mothers buried children beneath frozen soil, the sound of their cries replaced by silence. Stalin called it progress, but for millions of Soviet citizens, it was the dawn of a nightmare, and the beginning of a rule built not on hope, but on fear. The famine had broken the countryside, but Stalin's paranoia had only just begun. He saw enemies everywhere, in factories, in villages, even within the walls of the Kremlin. To him, loyalty was never enough. Only obedience mattered. The air in Moscow grew heavy with fear. The secret police, the NKVD, expanded its shadow across the nation. Whispers became weapons. A careless word could mean death. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Friends turned on friends. And a single accusation could erase a life overnight. To Stalin, the Soviet Union was a fortress under siege. He believed conspiracies lurked behind every closed door. Trotskyists, saboteurs, traitors plotting to bring him down. So he acted first, Lists were drawn, thousands arrested, hundreds executed, and still, it wasn't enough. In his private moments, Stalin studied the methods of other tyrants, even admiring Hitler's brutal purge of his own rivals. The idea was intoxicating. Total control through total fear. The revolution that once promised freedom had now devoured its children. And in the heart of the Kremlin, one man prepared to unleash a storm of blood that would change history forever. December 1st, 1934. Gunfire echoed through the marble corridors of Leningrad's Smolny Institute. Sergei Kirov, one of the Soviet Union's brightest stars, was dead. The assassin, a disillusioned former party member named Leonid Nikolaev, had slipped past security and fired a single bullet into Kirov's neck. But to many, the real mystery wasn't who pulled the trigger. It was who allowed it to happen. Kirov had been popular, too popular. Some whispered that he had become a threat to Stalin himself. And when the NKVD conveniently failed to protect him, suspicion spread like wildfire. Stalin seized the moment with ruthless precision. He declared the murder part of a vast conspiracy, a plot by Trotskyists and old Bolsheviks to overthrow the state. Within days, arrests swept across the nation. Men who had fought beside Lenin now stood accused of treason. The death of Kirov became the spark that lit the inferno. Behind closed doors, Stalin's eyes turned cold. He had found his perfect excuse, a reason to purge not just his enemies, but anyone who might one day become one. The halls of justice became theaters of terror. Under glaring lights and the gaze of the world, Stalin staged a spectacle, the Moscow show trials. The accused were not strangers, they were the heroes of the revolution. Men like Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and later Nikolai Bukharin. Comrades who had once stood beside Lenin himself. Now they were branded as traitors, spies, and assassins in service of foreign powers. Their crimes, impossible conspiracies, plots that stretched from Berlin to Tokyo, fabricated by the NKVD, rehearsed under torture, and performed for the cameras. In the courtroom, their faces were pale, their voices trembling. One by one, they confessed to deeds they had never done, their words broken by fear and exhaustion. The verdict was already written. Guilty. Firing squads worked through the night, and outside the people cheered, convinced they had witnessed justice. But what they had truly seen was something far darker. A dictator cleansing his past, rewriting history, and warning the nation that even the most loyal could fall. The revolution had devoured its own heart, and Stalin was the one holding the knife. By 1937, Stalin's paranoia had no limits. The show trials had eliminated his rivals, but now the hunt turned inward. No one was safe. Across the Soviet Union, NKVD agents moved by night. The sound of boots on stairwells became the heartbeat of terror. Families waited in silence, praying the knock wouldn't come for them. But it always came. Under NKVD Order 00447, the state unleashed a wave of arrests so vast it defied reason. Workers, engineers, priests, even children, all branded enemies of the people. Confessions were forced with beatings, sleep deprivation, and torture. Trials were replaced by quotas. 10,000 arrests, 5,000 executions. Numbers to be filled, not people to be judged. Entire factories lost their managers. Villages were emptied overnight. Men disappeared into the frozen gulags of Siberia, swallowed by a silence so deep it erased their names from history. Stalin called it cleansing, but in truth, it was fear given form, a machine that consumed its own creators. And as the purges grew, so did the body count. The revolution had promised equality, but what it delivered was death, stamped with the seal of the state. As the Great Purge devoured the nation, Stalin's gaze turned to those he deemed foreign within. The next targets were the minorities. Under secret orders, the NKVD launched national operations, brutal campaigns against Poles, Finns, Germans, Koreans, and countless others who had lived in the Soviet Union for generations. To Stalin, their bloodlines were potential threats, their heritage a mark of guilt. The Polish operation became one of the deadliest. In a single year, over 140,000 Poles were arrested. More than 100,000 were executed, shot in basements, buried in mass graves beneath the snow. Entire families vanished. Husbands executed, wives sent to labor camps, children torn from their homes and labeled sons and daughters of traitors. Their only crime, being born with the wrong name, speaking the wrong language, or living too close to the border. In the dark machinery of Stalin's terror, ethnicity became evidence, and identity became a death sentence. By the time the gunfire stopped, millions of lives had been shattered, their cultures silenced, their histories erased. The Soviet dream was supposed to unite its people. Instead, it turned on them. The roar of fear reached even the barracks of the Red Army. No longer content with purging politicians and peasants, Stalin now turned his suspicion toward the very institution that guarded his empire, the army itself. Generals, commanders, and heroes of the Civil War were suddenly branded as spies, traitors, agents of fascism. The accusations were absurd. Forged documents, forced confessions, whispered lies. But in Stalin's world, truth no longer mattered. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most brilliant strategists of his generation, was among the first to fall. Tortured into confession, he was executed alongside thousands of officers. Entire chains of command were wiped out overnight. The Red Army bled from within. When Hitler's spies watched from afar, they could hardly believe their luck. The Soviet war machine, once feared, was decapitated by its own master. Even Hitler himself cited Stalin's purge as proof that Russia could be conquered. But Stalin didn't care. He saw treachery everywhere, and survival in no one. The army was now his, loyal, terrified, broken. And the next great war was already on the horizon. When the smoke of the purges finally cleared, the Soviet Union was unrecognizable. Millions were gone, executed, imprisoned, or erased from memory. Families torn apart, generations silenced. And at the center of it all stood one man, Joseph Stalin, the architect of fear, the god of a broken empire. For decades, his portrait hung above every classroom, every factory, every home. Children learned to worship him. Adults learned to fear him. And no one dared to speak his name without trembling. But in 1953, the tyrant's heart finally stopped. And for the first time, the Soviet Union could breathe. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, would later denounce the crimes of the past, calling it the cult of personality, the sickness of a state consumed by one man's paranoia. Statues fell. Names were cleared. But the scars remained. The Great Purge had reshaped not only a nation, but the very soul of its people. It proved that revolutions, no matter how noble their beginnings, can be devoured by the monsters they create. And long after Stalin's death, his shadow still lingered, dark, silent, and eternal. From Lenin's death to the fall of Stalin, the Soviet Union's path was forged in fear, ambition, and absolute control. For decades, purges, propaganda, and paranoia ruled every corner of society, turning the nation into a machine driven by terror and loyalty. Yet, when Stalin's reign finally ended, a fragile dawn began to rise, a moment when the people dared to look back, confront the ghosts of their past, and search for truth amid the ruins of fear. It's a story of power and betrayal, of blind devotion and awakening, the haunting cost of absolute control.